The thermometer outside Antonin Novak's cabin read -30 degrees, and through his frosted window he could see his horses shivering violently in the barn despite 3 fires he had kept burning all night. A quarter-mile away, Josef Kovac's livestock stood calm and warm in a chamber 8 feet below the frozen earth, exactly as Josef had promised they would. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from, and if you appreciate stories of frontier ingenuity that saved lives, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might be even more unbelievable than this one. Josef Kovac climbed the stone ramp from his underground shelter at dawn on January 10, 1856, carrying a lantern in one hand and a thermometer in the other. The air above ground hit him like a physical blow. His breath crystallized instantly into ice crystals that hung suspended in air so cold it seemed solid. The thermometer in his hand read -28 degrees. Inside the shelter behind him, in the chamber carved 8 feet below the frozen Dakota Territory surface, the temperature held steady at 48 degrees. His livestock, all of them, stood on dry straw bedding in that constant warmth, exactly as he had planned 2 years earlier when his neighbors called him insane. He could see smoke rising from Antonin Novak's place a quarter-mile to the east. 3 separate columns of smoke, which meant Antonin had kept fires burning all night in a desperate attempt to warm his barn. Joseph had tried to warn him. He had invited all his neighbors to see the underground shelter after he completed it 14 months ago. He had explained the physics, demonstrated the temperature stability, offered to help them build similar structures. Antonin had laughed. So had Władysław Kowalski and Dmitry Petrov. They had called it a tomb. They had joked about burying livestock alive. They had questioned why any sane man would spend 6 months digging and hauling stone when a serviceable barn could be built in less than a week. Joseph walked toward Antonin's homestead. The snow crunched under his boots with the distinctive sound that only came at extreme temperatures, each step producing a squeak as ice crystals compressed and fractured. The sun was rising, but it provided no warmth. The light was brilliant and painful, reflecting off snow that had been on the ground since November. This was the coldest winter anyone in the territory could remember. The old-timers, the trappers who had been in these mountains since the 1830s, said they had never seen temperatures like this. Some claimed it had reached -35 during the night. Whether it was 30 or 35 hardly mattered. Both temperatures killed livestock with brutal efficiency. He found Antonin in his barn. The building was well constructed by frontier standards. Chinked logs with a solid roof, large enough for 4 horses and 2 cows. 3 fire pits had been dug into the dirt floor, and all 3 still smoldered with coals. Blankets had been draped over the horses. None of it had mattered. 2 of Antonin's horses were dead, frozen, standing in their stalls. The other 2 were alive, but shaking so violently they could barely stand. The cows had survived, pressed together in the corner farthest from the door, but their ears showed frostbite damage. Antonin sat on a hay bale, staring at his dead horses. He looked up when Joseph entered, but said nothing. His face was gray with exhaustion and defeat. Joseph knew that expression. He had worn it himself 2 winters ago when he found his mare Zora frozen in a barn just like this one. 2 winters before that frozen morning, Joseph Kovac had owned the finest mare in the territory. Her name was Zora, which meant dawn in his native Croatian, and he had paid $80 for her in St. Louis 3 years earlier. $80 represented nearly half a year's income for a homesteader. Most men would have considered it foolish to invest so much in a single animal, but Joseph understood bloodlines. Zora came from Kentucky racing stock. She was fast, strong, and intelligent. More importantly, she was a proven breeder. Her foals could be sold for $20 to $30 each, and she could produce a foal every year for a decade. Zora was not just a horse. She was Joseph's investment in his future, his plan for building prosperity on the frontier. Joseph had come to America in 1848, part of the wave of Croatian immigrants fleeing economic hardship and political upheaval in the Austrian Empire. He was 17 years old when he arrived in New York, with $11 sewn into his coat lining and a head full of mining knowledge learned from his father in the silver mines near Sarajevo. He worked in Pennsylvania coal mines for 3 years, saving every penny he could spare. In 1851, he moved west to the Dakota Territory, filed a homestead claim, and began building the life he had dreamed about during those dark years underground in Pennsylvania. The winter of 1853 to 1854 was harsh, but not unprecedented. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees for several days in January. Joseph's barn was typical frontier construction. He had built it in 5 days the previous summer with help from Antonin, using the standard method every homesteader learned. Logs notched at the corners, gaps chinked with mud and moss, a simple door, and a roof of poles covered with sod. The barn kept out wind and rain. That seemed sufficient until the night of January 23, 1854. Joseph woke that morning to silence. The wind that had been howling for 2 days had stopped. He dressed and went to check his animals. The cold hit him the moment he opened his cabin door, a deep, penetrating cold that felt different from normal winter weather. He found Zora standing in her stall, but she was not moving. She had frozen to death during the night. Her body was rigid, her eyes open, ice crystals coating her mane and flanks. She had died standing up, trying to stay warm until the end. Joseph stood in that barn for nearly an hour, looking at $80 of dead horseflesh, looking at his future plans frozen solid. He buried her when the ground thawed in March. He dug the hole himself on a hillside overlooking his cabin. He marked the grave with stones arranged in a careful pattern, the way his father had marked graves in the old country. While he dug, while he lowered her body into the earth, while he covered her with soil, a single thought repeated in his mind: this will never happen again. Joseph's father, Petar Kovac, had worked in the Bosnian silver mines for 32 years before he died in a cave-in when Joseph was 16. Petar had been a master miner, one of the men other miners came to when they had questions about tunnel stability or ore quality. He had taught Joseph everything he knew during the years Joseph worked beside him underground, and one of those lessons became the foundation for what Joseph would build in Dakota Territory. Miners understood something that most surface dwellers never considered. The earth maintained a constant temperature once you descended past the shallow surface layer affected by seasonal weather. In the Bosnian mines, summer or winter, the temperature at 50 feet depth remained approximately 55 degrees. In summer, descending into the mine felt like entering a cool refuge from oppressive heat. In winter, the same tunnels felt warm compared to the frozen world above. Petar had explained the physics to Joseph in simple terms. The earth was a massive reservoir of stable temperature. The sun heated, and the winter cold chilled only the top few feet. Below that, the temperature remained constant year-round because the sheer mass of Earth resisted rapid temperature change. Joseph had not thought about his father's lesson for years after coming to America. He had worked in Pennsylvania coal mines, but he had focused on surviving dangerous conditions and saving money, not on observing thermal properties. But after Zora died, the memory returned with clarity. He began thinking about the mines, about how consistent the temperature had been, about how his father had sometimes joked that miners had the best working conditions in winter because they worked in natural warmth while farmers froze above ground. Joseph started visiting root cellars. Every homesteader had one, a hole dug into the earth for storing vegetables through winter. In March, while the surface world still held frozen ground and snow, Joseph asked his neighbors if he could examine their root cellars. Antonin thought the request was strange but allowed it. Joseph descended into the 8-foot-deep pit where Antonin stored potatoes and carrots. He carried a thermometer he had purchased in the town of Yankton, an expensive instrument that cost him $3 but provided precise measurements. The root cellar registered 47 degrees. Outside, the morning temperature was 19 degrees, a 28-degree difference, entirely passive, requiring no fire or fuel or effort beyond the initial digging. Joseph visited 4 other root cellars over the next 2 weeks. All showed similar results. Underground temperatures remained stable between 45 and 50 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. The specific temperature varied slightly based on depth and soil composition, but the principle held true everywhere. The earth was a natural insulator and temperature regulator. Joseph started thinking about scale. A root cellar was typically 6 feet by 6 feet, large enough for storing vegetables. What if someone built a chamber 10 times that size? What if someone built a space large enough for livestock? Would the same principles apply? On April 3, 1854, Joseph invited his 3 closest neighbors to his cabin for supper. Antonin Novak arrived first. He was a Czech immigrant, 10 years older than Joseph, with a wife and 4 children. He had been homesteading in Dakota Territory since 1849 and knew frontier survival as well as anyone. Władysław Kowalski, who everyone called Wally because Americans found his given name impossible to pronounce, arrived shortly after. Wally was Polish, loud, generous, and skeptical of anything that deviated from traditional methods. Dmitry Petrov came last. He was Russian, quiet, deeply religious, and cautious about change. These 3 men represented Joseph's entire social world in the territory. They helped each other during harvest, shared tools, warned each other about weather and danger. Joseph fed them venison stew and bread. He poured whiskey he had bought specifically for this occasion. Then he told them his plan. He was going to dig an underground chamber large enough to house all his livestock. The chamber would be 8 feet deep, 20 feet wide, and 24 feet long. It would have stone walls and a stone ceiling supported by arches. It would have a ramp allowing animals to walk down from the surface. It would have a ventilation system providing fresh air. The earth surrounding the chamber would maintain a constant temperature of approximately 50 degrees year-round, warm enough to keep animals alive in the coldest winter, cool enough to provide relief during summer heat. The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Then Wally started laughing. He laughed until tears ran down his face. When he finally caught his breath, he said what the others were thinking. "Joseph, my friend, you are talking about burying your animals alive. You are talking about spending the entire summer digging a hole instead of farming. You are talking about building a tomb and calling it a barn." Antonin was more diplomatic but equally dismissive. "I understand you lost your mare. That was hard. But the solution is not to dig underground. The solution is to build a better barn above ground. Use more chinking. Make the door tighter. Maybe add a small stove. You cannot fight winter by hiding in the earth." Dmitry invoked God's design. Animals live above ground. This is natural order. Underground is for roots and dead things. You will create disease. You will create collapse. The weight of earth will crush any chamber you dig. This is not wisdom. This is grief making you think wrong. Joseph had expected resistance. He had prepared answers. He explained the physics. He showed them his temperature measurements from root cellars. He described mining principles he had learned from his father. He offered to demonstrate the concept with a small test chamber before committing to full construction. None of it mattered. His neighbors left that night convinced Joseph was making a terrible mistake driven by grief and stubbornness. Joseph began digging on May 8, 1854. He chose a location 50 yards from his cabin on a slight hillside that provided natural drainage away from where the chamber would sit. Most homesteaders built barns as close to their cabins as possible for convenience, but Joseph prioritized engineering over convenience. Water was the enemy of underground construction. Any chamber dug below ground level would naturally collect water unless properly situated and drained. The hillside location meant water would flow around and past the structure rather than pooling inside it. He marked the perimeter with stakes and string, outlining a rectangle 20 feet wide and 24 feet long. The dimensions were calculated based on animal space requirements. A horse needed approximately 60 square feet to stand and turn comfortably. Cows needed slightly less. Sheep could be housed more densely. Joseph's total livestock count was 2 horses, 3 cows, and 12 sheep. Adding space for walkways and hay storage, he calculated 480 square feet would provide adequate room without wasting effort on excess excavation. The first day, he removed the sod layer. He cut it into rectangular sections and stacked them carefully nearby. The sod would be useful later for roofing or for filling areas that needed vegetation restored. Beneath the sod lay 18 inches of dark prairie soil, rich and loamy, the kind of earth that made Dakota Territory attractive to farmers. Joseph dug through this layer steadily, piling the excavated soil in strategic locations where it would not need to be moved again. Every shovelful required thought about where it would ultimately rest. Beneath the topsoil, he encountered clay. The clay layer was dense, heavy, and exactly what Joseph wanted. Clay held shape well. Clay was impermeable to water. Clay could be worked when moist but became nearly as hard as stone when dry. His father had always said clay was a miner's friend for sealing and building. Joseph dug into the clay slowly, carefully, aware that this material would form the walls of his chamber. Antonin rode past on the 3rd day and stopped to watch. Joseph was 4 feet down now, standing in a rectangular pit, throwing shovelfuls of clay up to ground level. "You are really doing this," Antonin said. It was not a question. Joseph paused, leaning on his shovel, and nodded. "How long do you think this will take?" Antonin asked. Joseph wiped sweat from his face. 3 months, maybe 4. Antonin shook his head slowly. "That is the entire growing season, Joseph. You could plant crops. You could build 3 barns above ground. You could do many useful things. Instead, you dig a hole." Joseph resumed digging. "I am building something that will last 30 years and keep my animals alive. A regular barn lasts 5 years and offers no real protection. I think that is useful." Antonin rode away without responding. Joseph continued digging. By the end of the first week, he had excavated to a depth of 5 feet across the entire marked area. His hands were blistered despite leather gloves. His back ached constantly. His progress was measurable but slow. He did not care. This was work that mattered. Joseph's father had taught him that successful mining required understanding what lay beneath your feet before committing to major excavation. Digging blind was how men died in collapses or drowned in unexpected underground water. Petar Kovac had always insisted on test shafts, narrow exploratory holes dug at corners of proposed mining areas to reveal soil composition, water presence, and bedrock depth. Joseph applied the same principle to his livestock shelter. He dug 4 test shafts, one at each corner of his planned chamber, each shaft 3 feet square and driven down until he hit resistance or water. The northeast shaft reached bedrock at 9 feet. The southeast shaft found bedrock at 8 feet. The northwest and southwest shafts both stopped at bedrock 7.5 feet down. This information was critical. It told Joseph that bedrock sloped gently downward from west to east across his site. It told him he could safely dig to 7 feet depth without breaking through into fractured rock that might allow water infiltration. It told him the clay layer extended consistently to bedrock, providing stable material for construction. None of the test shafts showed water seepage. This was the best possible news. Groundwater would have complicated everything, requiring constant pumping or drainage systems that might fail. Dry clay meant Joseph could build without fighting moisture during construction. The test shafts also allowed him to examine clay quality at different depths. The clay near the surface was darker and contained more organic material. At 5 feet, it transitioned to lighter gray clay that was denser and purer. At 7 feet, just above bedrock, the clay was blue-gray and incredibly dense, almost like soft stone. This deep clay would make the strongest walls. Joseph spent 3 days studying how water moved across his site during rain. Dakota Territory springs brought heavy thunderstorms, and Joseph needed to understand drainage patterns. He dug shallow trenches around his excavation area and watched where water flowed during the next rainfall. The hillside location proved its worth. Water naturally moved downslope past the site. But Joseph noticed that water from upslope tried to flow toward his excavation, following the path of least resistance. He dug a diversion channel 30 feet upslope from his chamber, angling it to carry water around rather than toward the structure. The channel was 2 feet deep and lined with stones to prevent erosion. His father had taught him another principle. Underground structures failed most often at transitions between different materials or at points where water could concentrate force. Joseph planned his chamber accordingly. The floor would be solid bedrock, requiring minimal excavation below 7 feet. The walls would be clay reinforced with stone, combining the clay's natural impermeability with stone's structural strength. The ceiling would be arched stone, distributing weight across multiple points rather than creating flat spans that could collapse. Every joint, every transition, every potential weak point received careful attention during the planning phase. By early June, Joseph had completed his test shafts, his drainage analysis, and his final design calculations. He had modified his original plan based on what he learned. The chamber would be slightly smaller, 18 feet wide instead of 20, saving excavation time without sacrificing necessary space. The depth would be exactly 7 feet to the floor, keeping him above bedrock while maximizing the Earth's insulating effect. Joseph began gathering stones in mid-June. He needed approximately 2,000 individual stones of usable size to build the retaining walls that would line his underground chamber. The stones needed to be relatively flat on at least 2 surfaces to allow stable stacking. They needed to be small enough for one man to lift and position, but large enough to minimize the number of joints in the wall. Joseph estimated each stone should weigh between 15 and 30 pounds. The nearest source of suitable stone was a rocky outcrop 2 miles from his homestead, where glacial action had fractured limestone into irregular but workable pieces. Joseph hitched his remaining horse to a sledge and spent 3 weeks hauling stone. Each trip produced approximately 400 pounds of stone, roughly 20 usable pieces. He made the journey twice daily when weather permitted, morning and afternoon, gradually building a massive pile of limestone near his excavation. Neighbors passing by saw the growing stone pile and the deepening pit and shook their heads. The physical evidence of Joseph's project made it impossible to dismiss as mere talk, but that did not mean anyone understood or approved. The stonework began in early July. By this time, Joseph had excavated the full chamber to 7 feet depth. The rectangular pit measured 18 feet by 24 feet, with vertical clay walls. Rain had been minimal, and the clay walls held their shape well, but Joseph knew exposed clay would eventually erode or slump. The stone walls served 2 purposes. They prevented erosion and collapse of the clay behind them, and they provided a clean, stable interior surface. Joseph started at the northwest corner. He selected the largest, flattest stones for the bottom course, setting them directly on bedrock and packing clay tightly behind them. Each stone was positioned, checked for level, adjusted if necessary, and locked in place with smaller stones wedged into gaps. The first course progressed slowly because it established the foundation for everything above. An error at the bottom would propagate upward through every subsequent course. Yosef measured constantly, using a plumb line made of string and a stone weight to ensure vertical alignment. The corners required special attention. Yosef used the largest stones at corners, selecting pieces with right angles that would interlock with stones on the perpendicular wall. He had learned about corner construction from his father, who had explained that corners were where walls gained their strength or revealed their weakness. Yosef's corners featured stones that extended into both walls, tying the structure together. Between stones, he packed his clay mixture, not ordinary mud, but carefully prepared clay that he kept moist and workable. The clay filled every gap, creating a seal that would harden into something approaching the strength of weak mortar. The walls rose slowly. Yosef completed one full course around the chamber's perimeter, then started the second course, carefully offsetting the joints so no vertical seam ran continuously upward. This running bond pattern, another technique from his father's mining knowledge, distributed stress and prevented crack propagation. By late July, the walls stood 3 feet high. By mid-August, they reached 5 feet. By early September, they topped out at 7 feet, level with the original ground surface. Joseph stood in his completed chamber in mid-September and confronted the problem that could make his entire project worthless. The stone walls were solid. The excavation was dry. The dimensions were correct. But without proper ventilation, the underground space would become a death trap within hours of housing livestock. Animals consumed oxygen and produced carbon dioxide. A horse at rest produced approximately the same amount of carbon dioxide as 8 humans. 3 cows added the equivalent of 20 more humans. In an enclosed space, carbon dioxide accumulated rapidly, displacing breathable air until animals suffocated. Yosef had seen men die from bad air in the Pennsylvania coal mines. The warning signs were always the same. Candles flickered and dimmed. Breathing became labored. Men became confused and disoriented before they collapsed. Mining operations used ventilation shafts to move fresh air through tunnels, but those systems relied on natural convection or mechanical fans powered by surface equipment. Yosef needed something simpler, something that would work reliably without constant attention. He studied the problem for 3 days before developing his solution. Air moved because of temperature and pressure differences. Warm air rose, cold air sank. If Yosef could create a system where warm air from the chamber escaped through one opening, while cooler, fresh air entered through another opening, natural convection would drive continuous circulation. The challenge was creating openings that allowed air movement but prevented rain, snow, and animals from entering. Yosef designed a 2-pipe system. He cut 2 pine logs, each approximately 8 inches in diameter and 10 feet long. He hollowed out the centers using an auger and chisel work, creating tubes with 6-inch interior diameters. The work took 5 days because removing wood from the center of a log while maintaining structural integrity required patience and precision. One pipe would serve as the intake, drawing fresh air from the surface down into the chamber. The other would serve as the exhaust, allowing warm, stale air to escape. He positioned the intake pipe at the north end of the chamber, angling it downward from the surface so the opening stood 3 feet above ground level. This height prevented snow accumulation from blocking the opening. The pipe descended at a 30-degree angle, entering the chamber near the floor, where fresh air would naturally settle. Joseph covered the exterior opening with a wooden cap raised on short posts, creating a shelter that kept out precipitation while allowing air to flow underneath. The exhaust pipe was positioned at the opposite end of the chamber, entering near the ceiling where warm air accumulated. This pipe angled upward, emerging at ground level 5 feet from the chamber's south wall. Joseph extended this pipe vertically another 4 feet above ground and fitted it with a cap that allowed air to escape sideways while blocking rain and snow from falling directly down the pipe. To test the system, Joseph built a small fire in the chamber and watched smoke movement. The smoke rose to the ceiling, drifted toward the exhaust pipe, and flowed steadily upward and out. Fresh air entered through the intake pipe, creating a gentle but constant circulation. The completed chamber was useless if Joseph could not get his animals into it. Livestock would not descend a ladder or jump into a pit. Joseph needed a ramp gradual enough for a nervous horse to walk down comfortably, strong enough to support a 1,000-pound animal, and integrated into the structure securely enough to last decades. The engineering challenge was significant because ramps required either enormous amounts of earth moving to create a gradual slope or structural support to hold a suspended pathway. Joseph chose a compromise approach. He would excavate a sloped trench from ground level down to the chamber entrance, creating a natural ramp cut into the earth itself. The trench would be 10 feet wide to allow animals to turn around if necessary. The slope would be modest, dropping 7 feet over a horizontal distance of 28 feet, a 1-to-4 ratio that even nervous animals could manage. The excavation would require moving approximately 40 cubic yards of earth, roughly 400 hours of digging. He began the ramp excavation in late September. The location was on the east side of the chamber, where the natural hillside slope matched his ramp direction. Joseph dug downward and outward, creating a trench that widened slightly as it descended to provide better sight lines for animals entering. The walls of the trench needed reinforcement, or they would erode and collapse. Joseph used a combination of timber posts and stone facing, driving posts vertically into the trench walls every 4 feet and stacking stones between the posts to create a stable surface. Antonin rode by during the second week of ramp construction. He sat on his horse watching Joseph stack stones in a trench that led down into the earth. "You are building a road to hell for your livestock," Antonin said. The comment was meant as a joke, but there was an edge to it. Joseph's project had become a source of entertainment for his neighbors. They called it various names: the tomb, the livestock dungeon, Kovac's folly. Some neighbors brought visitors specifically to see the crazy Croatian digging holes in the ground. Joseph ignored the mockery. He had learned that explaining his reasoning changed no minds. Only results would matter. By mid-October, the ramp was complete. Joseph led his horse down the ramp as a test. The animal balked at first, suspicious of descending into darkness, but Joseph walked ahead with a lantern and the horse followed cautiously. At the bottom, in the chamber, the horse calmed quickly. The space was larger than a normal stall. The stone walls were cool but not cold. The air was fresh from the ventilation system. Joseph walked the horse back up the ramp. The animal managed the ascent easily. The test was successful. His livestock could access the underground chamber safely, which meant the shelter was finally functional. Joseph needed to validate his theory before winter arrived. He had built the underground shelter based on mining knowledge and physics principles, but theory and practice sometimes diverged. If the chamber failed to maintain stable temperatures, he would have wasted 6 months of labor and had no time to build a conventional barn before winter. The test would be simple. Monitor underground temperature through the summer heat and compare it to surface temperatures. If the Earth's insulating properties worked as expected, the chamber would remain cool even when surface temperatures climbed into the 90s. He purchased a second thermometer in Yankton, spending another $3 he could barely afford. One thermometer remained permanently in the underground chamber, hanging from a wooden peg driven into the stone wall at head height. The second thermometer stayed outside his cabin, mounted in shade to measure ambient air temperature. Joseph recorded both temperatures twice daily, at dawn and at dusk, maintaining a logbook with meticulous entries. July 18, 1854 provided the perfect test. A heat wave settled over Dakota Territory, pushing afternoon temperatures to 96 degrees. The sun blazed from a cloudless sky. The prairie grass turned brown from heat stress. Joseph descended into his chamber at 2 o'clock that afternoon, the hottest part of the day. The temperature outside was 96 degrees according to his thermometer. The temperature inside the chamber registered 51 degrees, a 45-degree difference. Joseph stood in the underground space and felt genuinely cool for the first time in 3 days. The air was fresh from the ventilation system. The stone walls were cool to the touch. The physics worked exactly as his father had described. He continued monitoring temperatures through late July and all of August. Surface temperatures varied from overnight lows in the 60s to afternoon highs in the 90s. Underground temperature fluctuated between 49 and 53 degrees, a variation of only 4 degrees despite 30-degree swings above ground. The data proved what Joseph needed to know. The Earth was indeed a massive thermal regulator. The underground chamber would protect livestock from temperature extremes in both directions, deadly cold and dangerous heat. In early September, Joseph invited Antonin, Wally, and Dmitri to see his data. He showed them his logbook with 2 months of temperature recordings. He explained what the numbers meant. If the chamber stayed 50 degrees during 90-degree heat, it would stay 50 degrees during negative 30-degree cold. The neighbors examined his records. Wally pointed out that Joseph had no livestock in the chamber yet. Maybe animals will change the temperature. Maybe their body heat will make it too warm in winter, or maybe they will somehow make it too cold. Joseph acknowledged this was possible, but unlikely. Animal body heat would add perhaps 5 degrees to the chamber temperature. That would make it 55 degrees instead of 50, still warm enough to keep livestock alive. Dmitri asked the question that mattered most. What happens if you are wrong? What happens if you put your animals down there in January and the temperature does not stay warm? Joseph answered honestly, then my animals die and I lose everything. By late October 1854, Joseph had completed every component of his underground shelter except the roof. The chamber measured 18 feet wide and 24 feet long, with stone-lined walls rising 7 feet from the bedrock floor. The ventilation system functioned perfectly. The access ramp allowed easy entry for livestock. But the entire structure remained open to the sky, vulnerable to rain and snow, useless until Joseph could seal the top with something strong enough to support earth weight, yet accessible enough to allow maintenance and emergency exit. The roof design was the most technically challenging aspect of the entire project. A flat roof spanning 18 feet would require enormous timbers capable of supporting tons of earth without sagging or breaking. Such timbers were unavailable on the Dakota Prairie. Joseph needed a solution that used available materials and distributed weight efficiently. He decided on a barrel vault design, an arched ceiling that would channel weight downward into the stone walls rather than creating a span that could fail. He cut 32 straight pine logs, each approximately 8 inches in diameter and 20 feet long. These would serve as the primary structural members. Joseph shaped each log carefully, removing bark and irregularities, creating consistent diameter from end to end. He notched the ends to sit securely on the stone walls. The logs would span the 18-foot width of the chamber, laid parallel to each other with 12-inch spacing between them. The critical detail was the arch. Joseph needed each log to curve slightly, creating a gentle arc that would direct weight toward the walls. Pine logs, when fresh cut, retained enough flexibility to bend slightly without breaking. Joseph soaked each log in the creek for 2 days, then positioned it across the chamber supported at both ends. He placed a heavy stone at the center of each log, gradually increasing weight until the log bent into a shallow arch. He let each log cure in this bent position for a week, allowing the wood fibers to compress and set. When he removed the weight, the logs retained most of their curve. He positioned the curved logs across the chamber in early November, working alone to maneuver each heavy timber into place. The logs sat in notches cut into the top of the stone walls, held by their own weight and by wooden pegs driven through the logs into the stone. The result was a ceiling of parallel curved logs, creating a low barrel vault. The arch was subtle, rising only 8 inches higher at center than at the walls, but that curvature was sufficient to redirect weight. Over the logs, Joseph laid split planks, each one hewn flat on the bottom surface and overlapping like shingles. The planks covered the gaps between logs, creating a solid surface. He used wooden pegs to secure each plank to the logs beneath. Over the planks, he spread layers of birch bark, overlapping each layer to create waterproofing. Over the bark, he applied a clay mixture, spreading it thick to seal every potential leak. Finally, over the clay, he replaced the sod he had carefully preserved months earlier when excavation began. On November 12, 1854, Joseph invited his 3 neighbors to witness the completed shelter. He had spent 14 months from first shovel to final sod placement. The structure was finished. Joseph wanted witnesses to see what he had built before winter arrived, before the crisis that would validate or destroy his theory. He also hoped, perhaps foolishly, that seeing the completed shelter might convince at least one neighbor to consider building something similar. Antonin arrived first, as always. He descended the ramp cautiously, ducking his head as he entered the chamber. The interior was dim, lit only by 2 lanterns Joseph had hung from ceiling hooks. Antonin walked the perimeter, examining the stone walls, touching the ceiling, testing the ventilation by holding his hand near the intake pipe. "It is well built," he admitted. "The stonework is good. But Joseph, this is still a hole in the ground. You are asking animals to live like moles." Wally and Dmitri arrived together. Wally made jokes as he descended the ramp. "Welcome to the underground hotel. Very fancy accommodations. No windows, no view, perfect for blind livestock." But once inside, even Wally grew quiet. The chamber was impressive despite its simplicity. The space was larger than most homestead cabins. The walls were solid. The air was noticeably warmer than the November cold outside. Dmitri walked to the thermometer hanging on the wall and read it aloud. 51 degrees. Outside, the morning temperature had been 38 degrees, a 13-degree difference on a relatively mild day. Joseph explained his calculations. In deep winter, when outside temperatures dropped to -20 or -30, the underground temperature would remain near 50 degrees. That temperature was warm enough to keep livestock alive indefinitely. No fires needed, no constant attention required, just passive thermal stability provided by the earth itself. He showed them the ventilation system, explaining how the 2-pipe design created natural air circulation. He demonstrated the ramp, walking up and down to show how gradual and safe it was. He offered to help any of them build similar structures, sharing everything he had learned about excavation, drainage, stonework, and ventilation. The 3 neighbors stood in the underground chamber and considered Joseph's offer. Wally spoke first. "Joseph, I respect the work you have done here. This is impressive. But I cannot spend 6 months digging when I can build a regular barn in 6 days. I have children to feed. I have crops to tend. I do not have time for projects like this." Dmitri agreed. "God put animals on the surface of the earth. This is where they belong. I will build a better barn, add a stove perhaps, but I will not bury my livestock." Antonin was more thoughtful. "I understand what you are trying to do, but the risk troubles me. If you are wrong, if something fails, your animals have no escape. In a regular barn, if there is fire or collapse, Animals can run out. Down here, they are trapped. I cannot accept that risk." Joseph had no counter-argument to offer. His neighbors were not stupid or stubborn. They had reasonable concerns based on frontier experience and common sense. Winter arrived in late November, with snow and temperatures dropping steadily through December. Joseph moved his 2 horses, 3 cows, and 12 sheep into the underground chamber on December 1st, 1855. This was earlier than necessary, but Joseph wanted time to observe how the animals adapted to underground living before severe weather made the shelter essential. The first day, the animals were nervous. Horses particularly disliked enclosed spaces and strange environments. Joseph's mare balked at the ramp entrance until he walked down ahead of her carrying an armful of hay. Once inside, the animals calmed faster than Joseph expected. The space was large enough that they did not feel trapped. The constant 50-degree temperature was comfortable. The ventilation provided fresh air without drafts. Joseph had built feeding troughs along one wall and a water trough fed by snowmelt he brought down in buckets. He spread straw bedding across the entire floor, creating a dry surface that absorbed waste. The arrangement worked. Within 3 days, the animals moved up and down the ramp on their own, grazing outside during daylight hours and returning underground to sleep at night. Joseph's neighbors prepared for winter using conventional methods. Antonin reinforced his barn with additional chinking and built a small stone fireplace in one corner for emergency heat. Wally stocked extra firewood and purchased heavier blankets to drape over his horses during the coldest nights. Dmitri did little differently than previous years, trusting in God's providence and accepting that some animals might be lost to severe weather. All 3 had survived previous winters with minimal livestock losses. They had no reason to believe this winter would be different. But the old-timers, the trappers and traders who had spent decades in the mountains, were warning about signs. Beaver had built their lodges with unusually thick walls. Squirrels had gathered larger food stores than normal. Woolly bear caterpillars showed wider black bands. The thickness of corn husks was greater than any year the old-timers remembered. These signs, according to frontier wisdom, predicted severe winter weather. Joseph heard the warnings and paid attention. Antonin heard the same warnings and dismissed them as superstition. The first serious cold arrived during the second week of December. Temperatures dropped to -5 degrees for 3 consecutive nights. Joseph checked his animals each morning. They were comfortable, standing calmly in the 50-degree chamber, completely unaffected by the cold outside. His neighbors' animals survived as well, though they showed stress signs. Shivering, huddling together, reluctant to move. The -5 degrees was cold, but not catastrophic. Standard barns with fire assistance could handle that temperature range. But the old-timers shook their heads. This was just the beginning. The real cold had not arrived yet. The first week of January 1856 brought cold that pushed the limits of standard frontier survival. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees on January 3rd and stayed there for 3 days straight. This was severe cold, the kind that killed livestock in poorly built structures and made even well-prepared homesteaders nervous. Joseph descended into his chamber each morning to check his animals. The underground temperature held at 49 degrees. His livestock stood calmly, eating hay, completely unaware that above ground the world had become hostile to life. Antonin's experience was different. His barn, reinforced and improved, was being tested seriously for the first time. The stone fireplace he had built worked, but maintaining fire required constant attention. Wood consumption was enormous. Antonin burned through 3 days of firewood in a single night, trying to keep the barn interior above freezing. His horses showed stress despite his efforts. They shivered continuously. Their breathing was labored. Ice formed on their manes from frozen condensation. But they survived. When temperatures moderated to -5 on January 7th, Antonin felt relief and satisfaction. His conventional approach had worked. The extra effort and firewood expense were worthwhile costs of keeping animals alive. Wally's barn was similar. He spent those 3 nights essentially living in his barn, keeping fires burning, draping blankets over his animals, working constantly to maintain survivable conditions. His cows survived, though one showed early signs of frostbite on her ears. His chickens, kept in a smaller enclosed coop within the barn, stayed warm enough from their own body heat and his fire. But Wally was exhausted. 3 nights of continuous fire management with minimal sleep left him haggard and irritable. He visited Joseph on January 8th, curious about how the underground shelter had performed. Joseph showed him the thermometer reading, 49 degrees. Wally touched the stone walls, felt the stable, cool temperature, watched the animals standing calmly. "This is remarkable," Wally admitted. "I nearly killed myself keeping fires going, and your animals are comfortable like it is spring." Joseph explained that the chamber temperature had not varied more than 2 degrees during the cold snap. The Earth's thermal mass was so vast that surface temperature fluctuations, even severe ones lasting multiple days, barely affected the underground environment. Wally asked the obvious question: "How cold can it get outside before your chamber cannot stay warm enough?" Joseph answered honestly, "I do not know. The physics suggests the chamber should maintain 50 degrees even if surface temperature drops to -40 or -50. But I have not tested it at those extremes." Dmitri lost 6 sheep during the -15 cold. His barn was less sophisticated than Antonin's or Wally's, and he had not built a fireplace or invested in extra insulation. The sheep huddled together, but their combined body heat was insufficient. Dmitri found them frozen on the morning of January 6th. He was philosophical about the loss. "This is frontier life. Animals die. We accept it and continue." But privately, Dmitri began reconsidering Joseph's approach. 6 sheep represented $40 of lost value, nearly a month's cash income. That was not trivial. January 9th, 1856, began with clouds and wind. The temperature at dawn was -8 degrees, cold but not unprecedented. Throughout the day, the wind increased. Clouds thickened from the northwest. By afternoon, snow was falling. Not heavy accumulation, but fine crystals driven horizontal by 40-mile-per-hour wind. Old trappers recognized the conditions immediately. This was the leading edge of an Arctic air mass, the kind of weather system that brought extreme cold and lasted for days. By sunset, the temperature had dropped to -18. By midnight, it reached -25. By 3 in the morning, thermometers registered -30 degrees. Antonin woke at midnight to check his animals. His barn was barely above freezing despite 2 fires burning continuously. He added more wood to both fires, draped additional blankets over his horses, and tried to seal gaps around the door where wind was penetrating. His efforts were inadequate. The extreme cold overwhelmed his heating capacity. By 2 in the morning, he could see his breath inside the barn despite the fires. His horses were shaking violently, their bodies fighting to maintain core temperature. Antonin stayed with them, feeding fires, trying desperately to keep them alive. Wally's experience was worse. He had 4 fires burning in his barn, consuming wood at a catastrophic rate. The fires created heat, but the heat was immediately lost through walls and roof designed to withstand normal cold, not -30 degrees. His cows pressed together in the corner farthest from the door, their combined body heat and proximity to fire providing marginal protection. But Wally knew he was losing the battle. The cold was simply too extreme. No amount of fire could compensate for the structural heat loss. Around 4 in the morning, one of his cows collapsed. Wally tried to get her back on her feet, but she was too weak. Hypothermia was shutting down her body systems. She died 30 minutes later. Dmitri did not even attempt to heat his barn. He had no fireplace, and bringing open fire into a wooden structure filled with dry hay was dangerous. He checked his remaining sheep around midnight, saw them huddled and shaking, and knew most would not survive. He prayed for them and returned to his cabin. There was nothing more he could do. God would decide which animals lived and which died. By morning, Dmitri had lost his remaining 6 sheep and his 2 goats. Everything gone in a single night. Joseph slept in his cabin. Around 2 in the morning, he woke and debated whether to check his animals. The walk to the chamber in -30 degrees was dangerous. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes, but curiosity and concern drove him outside. He wrapped every piece of clothing he owned around his body and made the 50-yard walk. Descending the ramp felt like entering a different world. The underground chamber was 47 degrees, slightly cooler than usual but still warm enough for survival. His animals were lying down, resting comfortably. They looked up when he entered, mildly curious, then returned to sleep. Joseph stood in that chamber for several minutes, marveling at the temperature differential, 80 degrees warmer than the surface. Dawn on January 10th revealed the full extent of the damage. Antonin emerged from his barn at first light, exhausted from a sleepless night of fire management. 2 of his 4 horses were dead, frozen despite every effort he had made. The surviving 2 were severely stressed, barely standing, with visible frostbite on their ears and muzzles. His cows had survived, but they showed similar cold damage. Antonin stood in his barn, looking at 2 dead horses, each worth $60, and felt something beyond grief. He felt the weight of financial disaster. $120 of dead livestock, representing nearly half a year's total farm income. Wally's losses were even worse. 4 of his 6 cows were dead. The 2 survivors were in such poor condition that Wally doubted they would recover fully. His chickens, despite being in an enclosed coop within the barn, had mostly frozen. Only 3 of 15 survived. Wally calculated his losses at nearly $200. 2 years of careful profit accumulation gone in one night. He sat on a hay bale in his barn, surrounded by dead animals, and cried for the first time since leaving Poland 8 years earlier. Dmitri's barn held only corpses. Every remaining animal he owned had frozen. His total loss was smaller in dollar terms, perhaps $80, but proportionally, it was catastrophic. He had lost his entire livestock operation. Without animals, his homestead was not viable. He would need to borrow money or sell land to replace basic stock. Dmitri stood in his barn and prayed, asking God why this suffering was necessary, receiving no answer he could understand. Joseph emerged from his cabin at dawn and walked to his underground chamber. The morning temperature was still -28 degrees. He descended the ramp expecting, hoping, dreading what he might find. His animals were standing, calm, eating hay from the troughs he had filled the previous afternoon. The thermometer read 48 degrees. Every animal had survived without distress. Joseph stood in the chamber, looking at his intact livestock, feeling relief mixed with awareness of what this meant for his neighbors. He led his animals up the ramp into the morning light. The horse emerged first, snorting at the extreme cold but healthy and strong. The 3 cows followed, moving easily. The sheep came last, their thick wool coats adequate for the short exposure to surface cold. Joseph walked them in a circle near the chamber entrance, letting them move and stretch, then led them back underground, where they would stay until temperatures moderated. As he worked, he saw Antonin approaching on foot, walking slowly across the frozen prairie. Antonin stopped 50 feet from Joseph's chamber. He watched Joseph lead healthy animals up from underground and back down. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "You were right. I lost 2 horses last night. Wally lost most of his cows. Dmitri lost everything. And your animals look like they spent the night in a spring meadow." Joseph did not gloat or lecture. He simply nodded. "I am sorry for your losses. If you want help building a shelter like this, I will help you." Spring arrived late in 1856. Snow remained on the ground through mid-April, and temperatures stayed below freezing most nights until May. But by the first week of May, the frozen earth had thawed enough to allow digging. Antonin appeared at Joseph's cabin on May 3rd with a specific request. He wanted help designing an underground livestock shelter. He had spent the winter months thinking about what Joseph had built, calculating the cost of his losses against the cost of prevention, and reaching the conclusion that his conventional approach was inadequate for extreme weather that seemed to be growing more frequent. Joseph spent 2 days with Antonin, surveying his land for the optimal shelter location. They found a hillside similar to Joseph's site, with good drainage and stable clay soil. Joseph explained every principle he had learned. Test the soil before committing to excavation. Dig drainage channels before digging the main chamber. Build stone walls as you excavate, not afterward, to prevent collapse. Create a ventilation system that relies on natural convection, not mechanical intervention. Build the ramp wide enough for nervous animals. Arch the ceiling to distribute weight properly. Use multiple layers for waterproofing. Every detail Joseph shared freely. Antonin began digging in mid-May. His 4 sons, ranging in age from 8 to 16, helped with the excavation. What had taken Joseph 14 months took Antonin and his family 7 months. They worked together efficiently, and they benefited from Joseph's experience, avoiding the experimental phases and mistakes that had slowed Joseph's progress. By December 1856, Antonin had a functional underground shelter, smaller than Joseph's but adequate for his reduced livestock count after the winter losses. Wally approached Joseph in June with similar questions. His losses had been catastrophic enough that he needed to rebuild his entire operation, and he refused to risk repeating the previous winter's disaster. Wally was loud, skeptical by nature, and proud, which made asking for help difficult. But he swallowed his pride and asked Joseph to teach him. Joseph provided the same patient instruction he had given Antonin. Wally began his excavation in July. He worked alone mostly, stubborn about accepting help, but he followed Joseph's principles carefully. His shelter was completed by January 1857, just in time for another severe winter that tested all 3 underground chambers successfully. Dmitri's situation was complicated by his poverty after losing everything. He could not afford to spend months digging when he needed to work for wages to survive. But Joseph, Antonin, and Wally organized a community effort. Over 2 weeks in August, the 3 men and their families helped Dmitri excavate and build a small underground shelter. Dmitri contributed labor and gratitude. The community provided expertise and additional manpower. By September, Dmitri had a chamber that could protect the few animals he managed to purchase with borrowed money. The experience marked a shift in the frontier community's attitude toward Joseph's innovation. By 1860, 17 homesteads within a 30-mile radius of Joseph's original shelter had built underground livestock chambers. The technique spread primarily through immigrant communities where Joseph's neighbors had connections. Czech families told other Czech families. Polish homesteaders shared information with Polish neighbors. Word traveled through ethnic networks faster than through general frontier communication channels. The shelters were never called Kovac shelters or given any formal name attributing them to Joseph. They were simply known as the smart way to build for people who took winter seriously. The practical advantages became undeniable through repeated validation. The winter of 1857 brought another severe cold snap, with temperatures reaching -35. Every underground shelter in the region protected its animals successfully. Standard barns, even improved ones with heating, suffered losses. The winter of 1859 was mild, but summer brought record heat with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees for a week. Underground shelters kept animals cool and comfortable, while surface structures became dangerous ovens. The shelters worked in both directions, protection from extreme cold and extreme heat, exactly as Joseph's physics had predicted. Joseph never promoted his innovation or sought recognition. He helped neighbors who asked for help and answered questions from strangers who heard about the shelters and traveled to see them. But he did not lecture or evangelize. The technique spread because it solved real problems and because people who adopted it survived better than people who did not. That was sufficient motivation in a place where survival was never guaranteed. Joseph left Dakota Territory in 1864, selling his homestead to a German family who valued the underground shelter as much as the surface cabin and fields. He moved to the Oregon Territory with money saved from 8 years of successful farming. He married Helena Petrovich, a Croatian woman he met in Portland in 1866. They had 5 children and established a small ranch in the Willamette Valley. Joseph never built another underground livestock shelter because Oregon's mild climate did not require one. But he told his children stories about Dakota winters and about solving problems through understanding physics rather than fighting nature. Joseph died in 1879 at age 48 from pneumonia. He was buried in a cemetery outside Salem with a simple stone marker listing his name, birth year, and death year. Nothing on the stone mentioned Dakota Territory or underground shelters or livestock saved from freezing. His family knew him as a quiet, competent man who had come from the old country, succeeded in America, and raised his children to value education and practical thinking. They did not know that chambers he had built decades earlier still stood in the northern plains, still protecting animals, still demonstrating that good engineering lasted longer than individual lives. The impossible had become routine through knowledge freely shared, proving that the best innovations were those that made survival not a matter of luck or heroism, but simply a matter of building correctly from the beginning.